Hello and welcome to Army of Crime, your favorite crossover podcast between the world of comics and movies. I am your co-host, Matt, and I'm here with my co-host, Dustin. Dustin, say hello to the... He's thinking about it. He's going to. He's got something real nice planned for you when he speaks up. This episode, we are looking at the Cecil B. DeMille epic, Unconquered, and the comic book Nat Turner, made by Professor Kyle Baker, both of which are works of historical fiction. And, well, there's a lot going on in both of them for both good and ill. I don't know what angle you want to tackle this from.
It would be hard to have two works of historical fiction have such diametrically opposing viewpoints, in my opinion.
Yes, and to have diametrically opposed levels of quality, I would also add.
Yeah, that's
we
also
could talk about we could talk about Unconquered first, I suppose.
Okay.
Unconquered is a Cecil B. DeMille epic from 1947, starring Gary Cooper, that ostensibly is sort of about the Pontiac's War, I guess.
But what it's really about is the unconquered spirit of the American frontiersman to tame the West.
Yeah, it's like a Western epic, I guess. And I was hoping at least for some good kind of battle scenes or something. It really doesn't, for all its supposed epicness, it really doesn't feel that epic. There's a lot of scenes of like people sitting around talking in rooms. There's like a courtroom scene. There's like one battle scene towards the end that isn't even that impressive.
Yeah, and the story is basically, I mean, there's an indentured servant played by Paulette, Goddard, and then you have Gary Cooper as like the rugged frontiersman, and their paths cross, and Gary Cooper is trying to prevent an Indian war, so to speak, between the settlers and the Indian nations west of the Allegheny. So basically, and I should maybe even put the audio of it in here, but this film opens with some voiceover narration from Cecil B. DeMille.
At the forks of the Ohio stands an American city, a colossus of steel, whose mills and furnaces bring forth bone and sinew for a nation. Not so long ago, a lonely outpost guarded this very spot. It was called Fort Pitt. It stood at the edge of an unknown land, one of a line of forts that ran from Virginia to the Great Lakes, marking the end of the known and the beginning of the unknown. Civilization was east of the Allegheny Mountains. Conquest, opportunity, and death lay to the west. All around Fort Pitt was a vast forest, always beautiful, always dangerous. Men came into it seeking many things, some for wealth, some for refuge, some for freedom. But to the Indian, all men came as invaders. Wars for survival between red men and white threatened to sweep away these little forts. Yet, men kept coming west, some to build their own fortunes, even at the price of Indian wars. Others to build a nation, even at the price of their own lives. These are the unconquered, who push ever forward the frontiers of man's freedom.
It's really quite, it's when people talk about movies like Westerns and other old Hollywood films that portray the Indians as mindless savages that need to all be wiped out in the case of mass genocide. This is kind of exactly the movie that they're talking about.
Yeah, so I really didn't know anything about this going into it, and I'm going to blame you because you picked this for us to watch. It's super duper racist in an unreconstructed 1940s racism way. As you mentioned, the whole thing is about the unconquered. In the title refers to the spirit of the American frontiersman who is like slowly moving out west or whatever. I mean, we could talk about. There's a couple main racisms. There's two big racisms that we could talk about. There's also the fact that it historically makes no sense whatsoever. Even as like historical fiction, it's like total gibberish.
But
And there's a minor racism tied in with that. There's a lot to unpack, just to like, even just if we just view it as like a cultural artifact or something from the 1940s. Okay, so number one thing, yes, it's super racist towards Native Americans. The word savage is used unironically on numerous occasions, and in fact, Guy Yasuda who's sort of the antagonist, is played by Boris Karloff.
yeah,
So we're not off to a great start.
there's a
even
lot
in
of,
the beginning.
as you would expect, there's a lot of white actors in makeup playing Native American characters, with Boris Karloff being the evil Indian chief.
Yeah, and very clearly this is meant to show us, these heroic white settler characters fighting Native people in a variety of ways. And there's a lot of hay made about these forts that surrender and then they get massacred or what have you during this conflict. And we could talk about that. I'm going to talk about that. I also want to talk about of like how this movie's even set up, because ostensibly Guy Suta is meant to be the antagonist or something, but there's also a white character named Garth who's also sort of the antagonist as well. So it's almost like we're telling the story of a Pontiac's War, which is what his history books kind of call this conflict. But we're also pinning it on a white like merchant who's like manipulating the people from all sides for his own benefit. He even makes a mention at some point that he owns all the land west of the mountain or something, and he's going to be king of it. So it's like, first of all, the portrayal of Native Americans is terrible. Second of all, they're also portrayed as not even fighting back against colonization or against their mistreatment at the hands of the British for that's own sake. It's like they're only fighting out because this other person, Garth, is like this crooked merchant, is manipulating them. And there's an emphasis put on all of the awful things that they do. They specifically mention like the threat of sexual violence against Paulette Goddard's character
Yeah.
from Native people is mentioned several times. And that falls into the category of something, warfare in this period could, of course, be very brutal. So it's not like that's not true, but we're, of course, ignoring all of the warfare directed at, the Native Americans. So it's like we'll only bring up the bad things from one side and not the other side, and then it makes one side look perfect and the other side look demonic, right?
Yeah. There's a really hilariously horrible like plot point going on here where the Indian tribes basically trick the honorable white man by telling them that if they surrender their forts, they'll all go free because the Indians just want access to their old ancestral hunting grounds. And then, of course, the Indians are lying and the honorable, trusting white men are all massacred. So it's like taking the actual reality of like the white settlers like constantly lying to the Indians about what they want and then like killing them all and like reversing it so that in this version of history, the Indians are dishonorable and lying and bloodthirsty, and the white men are just like, honest, upstanding citizens.
Yeah. And the Native people are not even smart enough to organize and fight a war on their own behalf. They're all also, while all that is also true, they're also just dupes, because the whole thing is just being manipulated by a white merchant.
Who is, in essence, in this movie, a race traitor because he's betraying his own white race to help the Indians.
Well, but he's not even helping them too, because it mentions something about how he owns all this land supposedly west of this line, so he wants them to abandon settlers. I think he uses the word king or something like at one point. So I think on some level, yes, he is siding with them. On some other level, he's trying to set himself up as some kind of like tyrant over some kind of Western lands. It's not real abundantly clear what his end game is here.
Well, he's in essence trying to check that unconquerable American spirit of exploration to settle the West. But little does he know that the American frontier spirit is unconquered.
The title of the movie, Unconquered, should really refer to like the Native Americans. It like unironically, that would make more sense as a title. No, this is just a straight up like unreconstructed white supremacist view of history, like without even any like caveats. The other I mean, there's a lot of super racism again towards Native Americans in a variety of ways because they are portrayed as being quite dumb. Like at one point, Gary Cooper tricks them with a compass, and I'm like, this is the mid 1700s. They know what compasses are.
Yeah,
like, everybody knows what a compass is. And these historical incidents they talk about, we could find examples of forts being massacred, I'm sure, but when you include no counterexamples and you don't include any examples of massacres carried out by settlers or frontier militia, which would be, I mean, they would just commit terrible crimes. I mean, and both sides would practice scalping. In fact, scalping is largely popularized as a practice during wartime by settlers, by frontiers people. You get this really, really, really unbalanced, really, I mean, it's racist. It's also inaccurate view of this whole period. If we want to talk about how historically inaccurate this movie is, historically it's total gibberish, right? So this is ostensibly about Pontiac's War, which is the name given to the fighting along this area, what in U.S. history books, this is a stupid name, but it's called the French and Indian War in U.S. history, which is like a dumb name anyway. But basically, it's the North American theater of the 7 Years' War. And the French normally held some kind of claim to this land, and they surrendered that claim to the British. And of course, the native people living there did not really understand it as such. They would have understood it. They were like leasing the area to the French. They're allowing the French to trade in the area, something like that. So when the French sort of sell them out and say, oh no, the British can occupy this land, you get the British moving in. And almost immediately a conflict breaks out because the British person in charge of this area is Jeffrey Amherst. And I don't know if that name sounds familiar to you. He's the guy who had the idea of spreading blankets with smallpox on them amongst people as like an act of biological warfare. Is put in charge of this whole area, and basically a conflict breaks out as the fighting in the North American theater has died down. It sort of starts up again while the war itself is still going on. So it's like a consecutive conflict, like the larger conflict is still going on. This theater dies down, the French pull out, and then the conflict starts again, basically because the British show up and start pushing their weight around. And the native people, they don't understand. Their understanding of the situation is not the French surrendered all this land. Their understanding is, well, the French were here and we were okay with that. Now the British are here and we're not okay with that, right? So it's basically a conflict based solely on the British showing up and trying to like boss everyone around. One thing that is in this movie is they mention that they don't allow guns to be sold, which is actually true because the British didn't want to sell weapons, but the French always sold weapons or traded weapons, which mostly would be used for hunting anyway. That part's, I guess, sort of historically accurate, but like you don't really get any of that in this movie. In this movie, the whole thing is just made up by this one guy as like an evil plot, right? He's selling weapons to the tribes, and then he wants them to go to war, as you said, as some sort of convoluted plan to stop Western expansion into this area.
So Cecil B. DeMille was a really conservative guy in real life. And so what he's done here is reconfigure American history into a patriotic paean to the unconquerable American spirit in 1947, which would be like the very beginning of the Cold War. So the whole point of this film, and this film was also apparently extremely popular at the time. Yeah, we've reconfigured American history to be the story of how Americans are about how American unconquerable and unbeatable, and how Americans are always caring about individual liberty and freedom and are going to conquer the West and, can't be defeated and all that garbage. So, yeah, like you said, we've, in this very specific time period of American 1947 with the ultra-conservative Cecil B. DeMille, we've reconfigured American history to be an ode, to that kind of spirit at the very beginning of the Cold War here.
Yeah, and we didn't even get to, so first is historical gibberish. It's super duper racist against Native Americans. It's also weirdly racist about slavery. And I don't know, like it's this almost bizarre thing. They in multiple points in the movie, they refer to her character as being a slave. She's like sentenced to indentured servitude as punishment for a crime. And then at multiple points, they actually refer to her as a slave, and they make reference to like slavery as a concept, but it's always in reference to like this white woman who's been sent to the colonies as like a penal like sentence. right?
Yeah,
So it's like we're making a movie. Also, we're gonna talk about slavery, and it's the mid 1700s. So plantation slavery of African people is now in full swing, in large scale, right? Slave ships are pulling up to the coast, and we're going to talk about slavery. And the movie is talking about how, she wants to have her freedom, and slavery isn't slavery a yucky institution, but it's all in reference to like this white woman, which is like this bizarre I mean, like you said, 1940s, it's like that's counter to the American spirit, but not in reference to like actual slavery. It's in reference to this white woman sentenced to indentured servitude.
Yeah.
And again, indentured servants were a thing, and sometimes they could be mistreated, and they were used as prisoners of war, or criminals could be sentenced to indentured servitude, and oftentimes, they might not outlive their own contracts, and they could be bought and sold and treated, like slaves in some kind of context, but they were not slaves in the same way that the people, transported from Africa and their descendants were slaves, right? So the movie, of course, makes no distinction of this whatsoever.
Yeah, it's pretty wild to tell a story about that touches on the horrors of slavery that focuses exclusively on white people, like white people enslaving other white people, and the like black slaves is not even like I mean, there are a few like black characters, and one of them does seem to be a slave, but the film does not seem interested at all in the crushing slavery of African people and black people as a possible way to have an ode to individualism and personal liberty, right? It's only interested in that in regards to, I mean, that I think displays the incredibly like blinkered viewpoint of the filmmakers in the fact that they use the story of a white woman being an indentured servant to tell a story about an ode to individualism and liberty and this, the yearning for freedom, while completely ignoring the far more brutal and horrifying, enslavement of African people on American plantations.
Or even the enslavement or treatment, enslaved-like conditions of Native Americans, which would also be a thing. And I found it to be, even if we're just looking at it as a film, and if we were to just be like Martians watching this, I mean, it seemed kind of boring. I feel like there's not a lot for ostensibly a movie about a war and about people. Like he goes on a secret mission at one point to assassinate someone, but it just never feels exciting. There's just a lot of like talking and like plotting and like people standing around, and like it's almost like some kind of political, you know what I mean? It's like it's not even like an exciting movie.
No, it's 2.5 hours long and it's extremely dull. It I've seen a number of Cecil B. DeMille films, and he is most interesting when he is like indulging in some kind of like weird perversity and sort of like combining his right-wing moralizing with this like, tantalizing hypocrisy around like, sex and violence. And this film has none of that, so it's just very staid and very boring and very dull, preaching and moralizing about the wonders of the American spirit. And I sometimes like Gary Cooper, and I feel like in certain roles I think he can do really well, but he also, his like when he would fall back on his standard movie star persona, there is sometimes like he's just like sleepwalking through these things. And this is kind of one of those movies where you have a lead performance from Cooper, which is just like really boring, and he's just seemingly putting in as little effort as possible. And I also like, in general, like Paulette Goddard, but she has really nothing to do in this movie other than swoon over Gary Cooper and constantly be in need of rescue.
Yeah, the gender aspect of this is pretty bad too. She's basically under the constant threat of being raped by various people throughout the movie, which is not said real explicitly, but she is. I mean, it calls her a slave, and Garth keeps trying to buy her, and then he wants her to marry him, and then they keep making reference to what terrible things the Native Americans will do to her if they capture her. So it's like, yeah, she's floating throughout the movie. She keeps getting rescued over and over again, and then there's this like thread of her being raped by a variety of people that keeps popping up. So in summary, I'm not really sure why anyone would want to watch this movie other than as a historical artifact from 1947. colonial American history can be very interesting, and if you make it accurate, I mean, like a movie about Pontiac's War, it was a brutal conflict. I've seen some historians refer to it as basically a race war because the impetus was to push out all settlers, and it almost worked. It's one of the few conflicts that ended in, I mean, it basically ended in a tie. The British government drew a line on a map and said settlers aren't allowed to go past this line. You could make a very interesting movie about that, right? But that's not this. No, just no.
Yeah, I had initially picked this movie because I thought it was about the Revolutionary War, and I thought, there are some movies about the Revolutionary War, but there aren't a lot that are very notable or very good, I guess. So I thought it might be interesting to look at one. And as I said before, I kind of do like Gary Cooper in certain movies. So that's what drew my interest to this initially. But yeah, then I discovered it's actually about an entirely separate conflict, and it jettisons any kind of actual, not only historical accuracy, but like interesting drama in favor of just a racist ode to American exceptionalism.
Yeah, this is the movie that when you make a documentary about how racist Hollywood used to be, you show clips from. This is like that kind of movie, which you kind of mentioned earlier.
Yeah, pretty much. It's really bad, and it's really boring, and it's just really offensive and stupid. There's really almost basically nothing that a person could recommend of this film. It's just a complete stinker.
Now, if we want to shift gears to something that is in fact really good, so I guess that's a good 180-degree counterpoint to this movie, would be the comic book Nat Turner, written and drawn by Professor Kyle Baker. So Nat Turner was a 4-issue comic series, ostensibly depicting the attempted slave uprising by the titular historical personage / character, Nat Turner. And there's a number of extremely interesting things that the author here is doing. This comic is, as a counterpoint to Unconquered, extremely historically accurate to the point where most of the text actually comes from primary source documents. It's almost like he's telling you a story, but it's also a historical document in a way. It's almost like a documentary in historical form, right? Because he uses actually a lot of primary source documents in the captions, in the quotations, and it tracks the voyage of slaves across the ocean, and it also shows them being captured in Africa. So they're captured, people are kidnapped or captured in Africa by African slavers, and then transported to the coast and sold to Europeans. And we see a great deal, there's a lot of violence here, obviously. Throughout the story, they throw a baby overboard at the beginning to feed to sharks, and he has a footnote explaining that sharks would follow the ships across the ocean to eat the bodies of people who fell overboard. And we see, there's a lot of stuff happening here. So we see that the slaves are not allowed to read, right? And one of the things that distinguishes Nat Turner from a young age is his intelligence and his desire to learn how to read, right? And there's a clear connection between a slave uprising and the slaves learning how to read or communicate with each other. I mean, there's a lot of other interesting historical little stuff that he puts in here, and he has footnotes, like I said. So we see the slaves are being forced to eat out of trough. We have them using drums to communicate because they don't have an effective way of sending messages around. And then we get to the slave revolt itself, which is extremely violent, right? We see they murder the slaves. Once they've started their revolt, they fan out, and we see them murder any number of white children as their revolt grows. So there's a great deal of violence throughout. And like I said, it's a very historically accurate. It's almost done in like a documentary style. The coloring of it is the coloring of like an old photograph. So it's not black and white. It's like a sepia toned or something almost. It made me think of the coloring on like old 1800s photographs.
And, I think importantly, unlike that old right-wing hack Cecil B. DeMille, the acclaimed cartoonist Kyle Baker, who has had a really long and interesting history of sort of dipping in and out of like mainstream big two comic books. Like he has acclaimed runs on like Deadpool and Plastic Man, and has done his own original like graphic novels and stuff. So he's a really interesting guy in his own right as well, like leading up to creating this comic book. But unlike that, the movie we watched, this comic does not flinch from the horrors of slavery at all, and doesn't try to like whitewash the history for some kind of ulterior message. The message here is just about the horrors of slavery itself, and it gives you all of the uncomfortable, gory details that
it kind of takes you through. I mean, there's a lot of emotional like notes that you're hitting here, because at the beginning, you're horrified at how the people are treated, obviously, and then the revolt starts, and you're like, yes, like let's rise up, like I'm like, you're on board with this, and then they're like, oh, we have to kill the baby now, and you're like, ugh, I don't. No, that's not great. We're killing a baby, and this shows them actually decapitating like a 3-year-old. That's like waving at them as they're marching down or as they're like coming down the road. So there's a lot of violence, and it is of course unrealistic to expect people, we're not trying to excuse the fact that they killed a baby, which is bad. No equivocation there, but it would also be unrealistic to expect people who had been brutalized their whole life to all of a sudden display more humanity to the people who are ruling over them in that class than they themselves had ever seen. The point being that it's an incredibly brutal system, and the book does not try and shy away from that at all.
Yeah, I mean, the point I was making was, once you have like someone who's gone through the experience of feeding their own child to sharks as an act of mercy to prevent them from having to grow up in this brutal system, like, that violence is then like repaid against the owner, the owner class, in a way
right.
that you might be like, well, do they really need to kill the children? But then it's like, did they really need to capture them in Africa and feed them to sharks and bring them over here to begin with? You appreciate the desire for historical accuracy in that it doesn't flinch from that and doesn't try to make the Nat Turner's revolt and Nat Turner himself into like an uncomplicated heroic figure, because he himself had this like messianic complex and thought that he was, I can't remember now, like the son of God or like God, or he saw himself as some kind of like you mentioned, he learned how to read, and then from like reading the Bible, he saw himself as some kind of like holy prophet to like lead like a holy war. So it doesn't like shy away from the fact that this guy, had like delusions of grandeur, and then also that their rebellion was, just as brutal as the violence that was waged against them initially.
Right. It would be easy to tell this story and try and have it be an uncomplicated ode to people struggling for freedom, such as we saw in the movie Unconquered, right? If you were to just literally flip that script 180. But that's not even what he's trying to go for. I mean, you get that in here. Obviously, the sympathy of the reader is with the slaves, but it's a violent process all the way around. There's no happy ending here. It even shows you at the end, and he provides a footnote for this too, that they like skinned his body after Nat Turner died. So it's just unending. I mean, it's like I said, there's really no happy ending here. There's no silver lining. It's just a brutal system, and a group of people try and revolt against it in a like almost an insurgency that doesn't last very long, and of course ends with violence. It has violence throughout. It's a grim story, but it's extremely well told. Like I said, he almost presents it as close to like a historical document as you could get in a comic book, like in a documentary style.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, yeah, he like set out to do something a little different than just retell this in graphic novel format. The choices that Kyle Baker made was to present this in more of a historical sense and to reflect all of the research that he had done. And as such, there's not a lot of like like dialogue balloons and stuff like that. It really does read more like you're saying, more in like a documentary style, which is not meant as a slight either. I mean, it's a very quick read, but it's a very, powerful read. It's definitely worth reading, I think, not only as like if you are into history, or even if you like don't care about history and the context of what's going on. I mean, it's just like a really powerful read as a graphic novel, as a comic book.
Yeah, and his use to not really use much for dialogue is interesting because there are balloons where they just have images and stuff inside of them to convey you what people are talking about. And part of that might be to skip over. I mean, at the beginning, obviously wouldn't be speaking English. I don't know if there was a desire to have not like you don't have to translate text or something, but it's interesting because it's almost no dialogue, and the dialogue that does exist is mostly taken from primary source documents. So you could read this on just a technical level as like, oh, this is a very interesting and very well made like comic book, and you also read it as something historical that happened about this, and that's interesting. And then just thematically, the characters in it, like what's happening in it is interesting. So it's really just well made all around. I mean, you could use this, might be a little violent for primary school. I mean, like a college class or something. I mean, you could look at this. You're getting a lot of information. Like you said, it's kind of a quick read, but it feels very weighty.
Yeah. And I like that even though there's like a focus on sort of like the documentary aspect and the facts, like the historical reality, he still draws it in sort of like an expressionistic style. So it's not like you're getting the documentary viewpoint with like extremely like detailed, quote unquote, realistic visuals. It's still drawn in this, as you mentioned, a sepia tone, very rough, very expressionistic style, which even while it's giving you these like documentary facts, it still lends it this real sense of like power and sense of urgency.
If it's not abundantly clear, it's really good, is what we're saying. It's really good.
Yeah, as you said, it's as good as that movie is bad. It's like the perfect counterpoint to that terrible movie is this comic book, which is a really great read on its own, and which also kind of corrects the record of, the horrors found inside American history.
Right. It's the kind of thing, it's if we want to spin this out a little bit just to talk about U.S. history, very rarely do stories get told that look at an unvarnished U.S. history. And I suppose that's because so much awfulness happens in U.S. history. But if you think of most media or most stories told historically, they're either hedging their bets in some kind of way, they're being very specific about what they're covering or what they're showing you. Very rarely does someone choose to tell a story where they just jump face first into history and just be like, this is all the awful stuff that happened. I'm thinking it makes me laugh kind of to think about the movie The Patriot starring Mel Gibson, which is a movie where Mel Gibson owns a plantation, and he clarifies at some point that he pays all of his like laborers or something, which is again like historical gibberish, but they're trying to like hedge their bets in some kind of weird way. And it's like that's usually what you end up with when someone makes something about U.S. history, is you either go the route that Cecil B. DeMille went, where you just take all the bad things, or not even bad things, the bad things from the sides, that you're not trying to show, and just cut them out and pretend they didn't happen. Or, Mel Gibson in The Patriot is you like sort of have them kind of, but then you hedge your bets and say, oh, actually it wasn't bad at all. Or it's here, but we're going to pretend that it's not, or something. Very rarely does someone just go face first into that and just say like, this is how it was. And you mentioned there's really no movies about the American Revolutionary War. I mean, there's very few comparatively. And you would think, obviously, how important it is. We all know 1776, George Washington, all this stuff. But I think that's why, is because it's if you really look at it from a unvarnished point of view, it does get very complicated. And I guess most people don't want to deal with the complication. So it's easier to make movies about like World War II or something, where it's pretty easy to make an uncomplicated, version of World War II, right? Because the Nazis are evil. But in the Revolutionary War, I mean, it's easy to make the British the bad guys, but
I mean, there are movies about the American Revolution, but there aren't many that are really like noteworthy. Yeah, and I don't wonder
If
which is strange.
Right, you would think, as patriotic as a country this is, and like the fact that we're all taught about how great the Constitution, all this stuff is. I mean, obviously the Constitution didn't exist during the Revolutionary War, but July 4th, 1776, all this stuff. And yet, because of that complexity, I mean, you could argue like very plausibly that enslaved people and Native Americans would have been better off had the colonies lost the Revolutionary War. I mean, there's a lot of things happening in that are, it's very difficult to show from like a proud, rah United States perspective. So I think that makes a lot of people shy away from it. Do you have a recommendation?
Yeah, there are two things that I'd kind of like to recommend that touch on both of the topics that we mentioned. They're both films. One of them is another Cecil B. DeMille film, and pretty much all of the films of his that I've seen have been very staid and very boring, except for this one, which was a pre-code drama called The Sign of the Cross, which is set in ancient Rome, and it involves sort of a lust triangle between a Roman prefect and the Empress of Rome and a young Christian woman. And as I mentioned before, sort of like the film, indulges in both of Cecil B. DeMille's weird obsessions, which is like right-wing moralizing, but also, unchecked sexual perversity and violence. So in this film, you get like these brutal scenes of Christians being killed in the Colosseum, like having their heads stepped on by elephants and like fed to crocodiles, and getting raped by gorillas. And there's like all these scenes of people being tortured and like all this brutality and violence. And this is also the film that famously has the Empress of Rome bathing in a giant pool of milk. So it's like, and as I mentioned before, the triangle between these characters is not so much a love triangle as a lust triangle. So like the whole plot is put into motion by like the unbridled lust of these three characters. So then I think it finds something really thrilling and really interesting in combining these like two completely opposite like impulses. It's a really fascinating, really interesting film. And so far, I think of the ones I've seen, it's the only Cecil B. DeMille film which I think is actually really good. And just because it's, grappling with these, opposite instincts in him as an artist. So that's The Sign of the Cross. And there's another film that I watched recently that is an Australian film called The Nightingale. And this film is set in Australia, in Australia's colonial history. So it's not America per se, though of course there are a lot of similarities. But this film is sort of like an unflinching, brutal look at the horrors of British colonialism in Australia. And the main character is an Irish convict who's basically enslaved to a British officer who, and these like British officers like gang rape her and like kill her whole family. And so she sets out on revenge, and then of course interacts with the Aborigines characters who are also being like brutalized and murdered en masse by the British colonial forces. So it's a film that really, in like a really uncomfortable way, does not like it shows you like the full brutality of like the colonial occupation of Australia with like mass gang rapes and murders and genocide. And so it's kind of like, the full, more like warts and all perspective that we were contrasting something like The Unconquered with. But like I said, in Australia instead of America, but obviously there's a lot of similarities in general as far as the way that the white people treated the people who are already living in the continent that they arrived at. With the extra wrinkle here is that you have like a layer of white people below the English, but above the Aborigines, in this case, the Irish. So that's Jennifer Kent's The Nightingale. That one is on Hulu if you want to watch it. It just came out last year.
Well, that's our show for this week. You can catch us on the internet at armyofcrime.com. I am on Twitter at armyofcrime. Dustin is at Dustin44444. If you want to leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, if you found our show interesting at all, please feel free to do so. We definitely appreciate any and all reviews, kind words. Stay alive out there, people. Should I do the thing?